Hey, well, what's up, everyone? Welcome back to The Collision. It is Daniel here, and I'm excited, honored today to be joined by a very special guest, and that is Mr. Joshua Enck. He is the director of the recent film, The Great Awakening, which is available to stream now on the Wonder Project, as well as to rent on really all major digital platforms. Thank you, Joshua, for just taking the time to stop by and talk about this new film.
Yeah, Daniel, thanks for having me, and for everyone who's listening.
Yeah, so this is your second film, following, I Heard the Bells, I think in 2000, was that
22.
22? Which I'll say, I really enjoyed that film. It kinda combined, my 2 loves of literature and Christmas, so, I was a big fan
Nice.
of that film. Obviously a very different film in some ways from this one, although
Yeah.
similar in that both are, like, historical biopic dramas about, notable kind of people of faith. What is it as a storyteller that kind of about these types of stories that interest you?
Yeah. Well, again, thanks for having me, and great question. Here at Sight and Sound, we bring the Bible to life on stage and screen. We do live stage productions, and we just got into feature films back in 2022 with I Heard the Bells. And, we were just kind of getting our feet wet with that film. But what we have committed to here as an executive team and the board of directors at Sight and Sound with films is to tell the stories of figures from history that changed the world because Christ first changed them. We want to tell true stories. We want to keep the legacies of those gone before us alive. Even though they're not with us anymore, they've moved on, their prayers are still being carried out, their messages are still being carried out. And we want to be torchbearers of those truths and things that they shared. And so, for us, we wait on the Lord to find out, okay, Father, what story do you want us to tell? Whose story from history needs to be told today for today's church, capital C church? And so we started with Henry Longfellow, a famous poet that wrote the famous poem during the Civil War. I heard the bells on Christmas Day and the true story behind that. And we were shocked at the response that we had, climbing number 2 in the box office in November of 2022. And then staying in theaters all the way through January. So we knew that we wanted to do a second film. And knowing that the 250th anniversary was going to be upon us this year, we started making preparations for a film about this time period, about the revolution. And we discovered this friendship, this unlikely friendship between Benjamin Franklin and the preacher named George Whitefield, and that there was a revelation before the revolution. That's what drew us to this film, is to lay a foundation for the beginning of this nation.
Yeah, and obviously Whitfield and Franklin are fascinating individuals just on their own as individuals, but really it is that just that dynamic, that partnership and friendship that in many ways I think is unexpected. And I think there's a one of my favorite scenes in this movie. I know a lot of people's favorite scene is where they're together in the storm with the kite. And there's a great quote where Franklin says, "You are the lightning bolt, George. I am just the lightning rod." And then Whitfield responds, "And who is the source, Ben?" And to me,
Right.
that seems to sort of encapsulate just their unique and important dynamic and partnership. What was it particularly, like specifically about that partnership and dynamic between those characters that made you want to tell this specific story?
Well, I mean, it's just so unusual. The fact that they were even friends. I mean, they had completely different views on so many things, but they were attracted to each other because there was a mutual respect for what each other can bring to culture. Politics and government are downstream of culture. And from 1739 to 1770, the time of the Great Awakening, when George Whitefield was preaching and Ben Franklin was promoting those revivals, that was a 30-year period of time where there was a complete cultural overhaul, where it was the first shared experience among the 13 colonies, where they were wrapping their whole lifestyles and belief systems around the same thing, these Judeo Christian values. And so that's what created this self governing people to make that decision in 1775 to say, we dealt with the tyrant within ourselves. Now we're going to deal with the tyrant across the sea. And so for me, what attracted to me to this story and these people and their friendship was that what they did together, as different as they were, when they came together, what they did for humanity, for this nation is absolutely stunning on all levels. And I would say, even without them, without Ben Franklin behind his printing press promoting these revivals, And without George Whitfield's trumpeting voice proclaiming truth, without those two things together, it's possible that there wouldn't have been the revolution, because something had to create this self-governing people. And these revivals did that for 30 years, 3 decades of preaching and promoting that created this cultural overhaul. And then politics were all downstream of that. But what I really love about the impact that Whitfield had on Ben Franklin is, that didn't stop when Whitfield passed away. It carried on to 1787 in June when Ben Franklin stood up at the Constitutional Convention in front of 56 delegates, and they were at a stalemate. And he said, "Have we forgotten our powerful friend?" And he actually makes a proclamation of faith and a petition for prayer. Benjamin Franklin, the most celebrated deist of all of our founding fathers, stood up and said, "Have we now forgotten that powerful friend? And do we not consider the Father of lights to illuminate our understandings?" He didn't just make that up. That came from a source somewhere. And so that whole idea of who is our source, that's the big idea of the film. And that's what Ben Franklin gets to when he realizes the source of this government, the success of this nation, isn't dependent on man's understanding and knowledge. It's dependent upon the source.
Yeah, and I'm gonna ask you about that scene in just a moment. 'Cause that is such a pivotal and just a fascinating, I mean, historical scene and a great or event and a great scene in the film. But did want to ask you too. I know with a lot of films about cherished historical figures, there can be like a danger of a sort of hero worship or just
Mhm.
depicting them in like the most positive light possible. I know this was a conversation with things like the Michael Jackson movie or just it's being out there. How do you depict these figures? What I like about this film, you did it in I Heard the Bells as well, but you include some very honest and, like, unflattering parts of, really
Yeah.
both their legacies with, Whitfield and the slave ownership and, Franklin with some of his, infidelities, like, why was it important, for you as a director to include those maybe less, favorable or rosy, events in their life?
Yeah, well, I think the answer is pretty obvious. I think today we see so much and we know so much today. With social media and especially the younger generation. I have 4 children and a son-in-law, so I have 5 children, and they're seeking authenticity. Honestly, like my 20-year-old daughter, she just came back from the missions field, and they are seeking authenticity. They can handle the good and the bad about people, and that's what they want, and because they know that's what they are. Everybody's flawed. Everybody except for Jesus Christ is flawed. So why are we trying to sugarcoat or make rosy these people, these heroes? There are no heroes if we're looking for flawless ones. They don't exist. And so rather than, dance around it, why not move toward it? Because that's where ministry happens. That's where character development happens. That's where honesty occurs. And that's where we, as an audience watching these films, can be wooed closer to the heart of these heroes, these protagonists and ingenues of these films. And so I also didn't want to um, create a film that would put George Whitfield on a soapbox, on a box, and lift him up, on a like a marble statue. Because at the end of the film, I don't want people to walk out of the theater worshiping George Whitfield. I want them worshiping the God, the Lord that George Whitfield preached about. And so bringing up Whitfield's flaws helps us to dismantle this idea of idol worship and hero worship. So drawing people to the source, who is God.
Yeah, and I love this. I think the story is more powerful because of the flaws that they God used in spite of. You've already mentioned like the good that they did accomplish because there's a quote in the movie where Franklin says, Whitfield was the revolution. I think like this film to me is not it's not like an offensively overtly political movie, but I think it does very much deal with just exploring how Christian teaching and truth really was, like you mentioned, like the bedrock of America's founding. And even the film itself kind of ends with Whitfield essentially kind of preaching, declaring his message like direct to
Mhm.
camera. I know like you're doing a story on the history, but like, do you feel like that message and the way that you ended the film, that the message is like needed for America today?
Yeah, no, I do. And look, we didn't set out to make this highly politically charged film or show our our position on politics, on which side of the aisle we sit on. We just told a true story, and stuck to the truth. I mean, what I was really excited for when this once this film released in April 3rd, was for people to try to break it, people to try to Google it and search it and say that didn't happen, that didn't happen. There is not one piece of critique that I've heard from anybody, and maybe there's some out there that haven't seen it yet, but that has found something historically wrong with this movie. Did Ben Franklin and George Whitefield fly a kite together? Maybe not, but they could have. That's like one fictional moment that might have been, you can maybe try to prove me wrong on. But our heart was that the truth is more interesting than, you know, uh, creating false testimonies, about these men. And so we wanted people to just anchor themselves in a movie that inspired them, educated them, and also brought some context to the 250th anniversary. Before the fireworks and the cannons and all the explosions of the 4th of July, prophetically getting a film like this in front of the masses to say, this is what led up to the revolution. There was a revelation before the revolution, and that revelation was that there is a Judeo Christian skeletal framework to this nation that's undeniable. And what led to so many of the documents and events that took place in 1776. So that's our heart is really just to move people's hearts towards him through the power of story and true stories.
Yeah, and I'll say too, my father is actually a historian, so I put your film to the test, and he loved it, and he did not find
Nice.
anything. So you're correct. There doesn't seem this does seem to be very close to the true story. I did want to ask you about the scene you mentioned, that the moment where Franklin sort of addresses the
Yeah.
assembly. It's kind of a part, the climax of the film, and like you said, one of the least religious founding fathers in many
Yeah.
ways, and yet he's the voice of sort of religious, kind of moral, clarity, which is just a fascinating, moment in history. As you were, like, writing the scene and just, envisioning that, like, how did you just kinda navigate depicting his somewhat, like, religious ambiguity, like, to be honest to who he was and maybe not put words in his mouth that he wouldn't, say? And I'm curious too, just what you make of that moment, like, what you a as you sort of researched the character and spent time with him, like, where do you think that his faith and, kind of was at the end of his life?
You know, uh, we didn't write a single word to that speech. That speech is word for word what Ben Franklin actually said in June 1787. And so that was an easy script writing day for us. Just copy and paste. And it's powerful. And, we really studied that speech first before we wrote a lot of his character in, act one of the script, because that came from somewhere. He's not just saying that to bring those 56 delegates together because they're, having a stalemate. He said that because he believed it. In fact, in his speech, he says, I firmly believe this. And he says, have we now forgotten that powerful friend? And then he petitions for prayer to take place every morning. You see, Ben Franklin is an incredible observer of humanity and nature itself. He studied the clouds and the lightning. He studied the water and the tides. He studied people, and he knew what moves people. And he knew that in that moment, there's only one source that he could draw from that would truly change the stalemate and stiff nature of that convention, and that's truth. And so he brought them back to the source, being God Himself. And so he's incredible, and that fact that he stood up and said that, and he's a very private man with his faith. In fact, he said, this is a quote from him from history, "If I were ever to have this born again experience, I would never give you or anyone else the privilege of knowing it." And so he went to his grave with that commitment. So we never got a confession of faith from him. But you can judge a tree by its fruit, and there's certain things in his life that he did and said that you know, makes you scratch your head and wonder where he really stood. And so I have my opinions, but I didn't feel like it was our responsibility to try to convince anybody of anything. Our responsibility as storytellers of sight and sound is just to simply put the truth out there and then let people draw their own conclusions.
Yeah, well, I think it was handled. I think it was handled excellently. Kind of the last question for you is: I know as a storyteller, you want to entertain people, and this movie does that. This is an entertaining, a fun movie to watch. But maybe beyond just that, like, what do you hope audiences that maybe missed it in theaters, or they're going to catch this movie on Wonder or streaming, and like as the director, what would make this film a success to you? Like, what do you hope audiences take away from the experience?
There's so many layers in this film, and I have had people come up to me and say, "I watched the film 3, 4, 6 times." I was just in Philadelphia on July 3rd, and I was a part of a worship experience in front of Independence Hall, right there at the Liberty Bell, and I had the microphone for 10 minutes, and I just shared, that scripture verse that's on the Liberty Bell from Leviticus, which is, "Proclaim liberty throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof." And I shared, a lot of people have their own definition of what liberty is. You know, does it mean ultimate freedom? I can be what I want to be, say what I want to say, do what I want to do. Well, the answer to that is no. That leads to ultimate bondage. If we're left to our own devices, it's going to get us into big trouble. The liberty that's on that bell, the liberty that's being proclaimed on that bell, the liberty that's being proclaimed in this film, A Great Awakening, is only found in one place, and that's in the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And we did not want to sugarcoat or, soften that at all. We felt a very bold responsibility to proclaim that kind of liberty to the masses this year on our 250th anniversary before the fireworks and the cannons.
Yeah, well, I love your heart for this film. I love what you and Sight and Sound are doing with these films. I hope there's a third film coming.
There
To
is.
continue on. Can you, real quick? I know we're out of time. Can you say what
It's
the?
a true story of a figure from history that changed the world because Christ first changed them. I'll say that.
Awesome. Well, that will get me excited, anyways. Well, thank you so much for taking the time and for what you've accomplished with this film.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Such a great honor to be here with you.